Givers always attract takers. If you don't have boundaries around how you give, you will always attract people that don't have boundaries with how they take. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Soul Work podcast with myself, Alexis. Over here we are about prioritizing what matters the most, but unfortunately is often overlooked, and that is the soul work. The soul work is made evident in our character as well as our choices. It's vital, it's essential, but over here we do the soul work together. On today's episode, I wanted to speak about the cost of being easygoing. We often hear of easygoing and it comes across as a virtue, and in some ways, it truly is. Someone who's easygoing is someone who typically seeks harmony, someone who doesn't rock the boat, they're not too confrontational, so they find themselves oftentimes avoiding conflict. But there are often costs that come with being easygoing, and hidden costs at that. Such a person can sometimes find themselves prioritizing other people to the extreme where they deprioritize themselves. If that is you or someone that you know, then this episode is for you. So in my line of work, I typically find that there are two types of easygoing people. You get the naturally easygoing person. They tend to be quite phlegmatic in their temperament. So they don't really, they value peace, they value harmony, and those are things that they work towards. But then you have easygoing as a learned behavior. Now, as a learned behavior, such a person doesn't speak up as much, not because they don't have much to say, but because they're not sure that their voice will be valued. This is often rooted in immense unworthiness and shame. And in more extreme scenarios, they take the path of being easygoing as a way of garnering love and support because they're not fully sure that they can achieve those results just being themselves or taking up more space. Now, there are emotional, mental, spiritual, hidden costs to being easygoing, and we often aren't aware of it until we have reached the end point, which is often burnout and resentment. Now, resentment comes up a lot in the therapy room, especially when such a person has reached the point of feeling undervalued and they're completely burnt out. They feel as though their efforts aren't being noticed or appreciated and are certainly not being reciprocated. I like to say that givers always attract takers. If you don't have boundaries around how you give, you will always attract people that don't have boundaries with how they take. And so if you are an easygoing person, it's going to be vital for you to implement boundaries, but we will come to that. I think the first thing I want you to consider as an easygoing person is the prioritization of self. Somewhere along the line, you probably believe the lie that you don't matter, that your views or your voice don't matter, and that's completely incorrect. If you don't start prioritizing yourself, it's going to be harder for the people in your life to prioritize you. So what does that look like? That looks like actively taking the time out to ask yourself, what do I need? What do I think? How do I feel? Making space for yourself, acknowledging your own worthiness to the same rights that you give other people. You give people space to share their voice, their opinions, their thoughts, their demands, whatever it is. But you're giving yourself that same right that actually I have emotional needs. I have things that I think, I have emotions that are coming up. And so it first starts with you. I find that when we don't receive what we need from ourselves and receive what we need from God, we tend to be extra grabby in taking it and trying to take it from other people. So the first thing is to actually make the effort to prioritize yourself. I encourage reflective journaling as a great way to do this. At the end of each day, sit down with your pen and paper and ask yourself, how did today feel? I do the acronym SIFT, S-I-F-T, and the first is, what sensations have I experienced today? That can feel like the sensation of fatigue or just overwhelm or just tiredness. Then I ask myself, what images have I had today? What images? And an image is a projection of the heart. So what are the things that I'm imagining? I see myself letting people down. I see the people in my life not being happy with me. Essentially, you're just giving yourself a better look into what's going on in your heart. The same is true for feelings, which is your F, and then T, which is your thoughts. Essentially, just sitting down with your journal and just really introspecting. And I love this space because what I tend to do as well is I make that journaling space sacred. I invite the Holy Spirit into that space and I ask him, what do you think about these things? This is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm picking up. This is what my soul is picking up. What do you see in this situation? So it's about finding the space to prioritize your voice to yourself. The second thing I would say is, what's your self-talk? Your self-talk is an indication of how you feel about yourself. And so for many of us, we show our lack of prioritization of ourselves in how we speak. We say things like, oh, I'm so stupid, or like, oh, I don't have anything good to offer, or I don't have anything good to say. We can be hypercritical in how we experience ourselves and we push that forward. But actually, changing your self-talk to represent someone that I actually add value and I have something to offer the spaces and the places that I'm in. And so I like to say, like, I'm intelligent, I'm smart. And I don't always feel that way. I'll be very, very honest with you. But saying it is a way of affirming the truth that I know of myself. The third thing is to set boundaries, and this is probably for the easygoing person going to be arguably the hardest thing in my list, because you've gone for so long not having boundaries to avoid conflict. And I think somewhere along the line we've taught ourselves that conflict is inevitably a wrong thing or a bad thing, and it's just not. Conflict is a part of life. And so erecting boundaries and putting them in place and maintaining them can be really, really difficult, but is really incredibly necessary. And so for you, I would definitely say, think about the boundaries that you currently don't have that you need. The easygoing person typically doesn't put a lot of boundaries around their time. You know, like, they don't come off the phone. They're the person that might find themselves, for example, on the phone and it's 1 a.m., it's 2 a.m. They want to come off the phone, but they're still listening to their dear beloved friends rant or whatever it is. Being able to set a boundary is able to say, hey, friends, hey, girls, I need to go. I'm super tired. I've got an early start in the morning, but can we pick up on this at another time? It's finding a way to really, really set boundaries. And that's just with friends. I think setting boundaries with strangers as well, being able to really say what it is that you want and what it is that you don't want. And a part of setting boundaries is self-advocacy. Self-advocacy, another term that comes up a lot in therapy, because so many of us have learned that advocating for yourself is inherently wrong, and it's not. So you might find yourself being the person at the nail shop and they're doing your nails and they're doing it completely wrong. And rather than advocating for yourself and saying, hey, I really don't like that, like, can you, that's not what I asked for. Oftentimes the easygoing person just takes it. So you don't advocate for yourself. You don't set a boundary. Another example, and I think a lot of my African sisters can relate to this one. You know that auntie's doing your hair wrong. That's not the hair that you asked for. That's not the hairstyle that you asked for. But because you're an easygoing person, you're conflict averse, you sit there and you take it. The center parting is off to the left, okay? That's not what you asked for. The braids are not giving what you thought it was gonna give. But we don't say anything because we're conflict averse. So teaching yourself to set those boundaries and to advocate for yourself. And it's as simple as just saying, can I have a look in the mirror, please? I'm not too sure this is what I asked for. This isn't what I requested. I would prefer it to look a bit more like this. Having these scripts that you've already prepared to enable you to set adequate boundaries. Will everyone be happy with your boundaries? Absolutely not. Especially the people that benefited the most from you not having them. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't set them. Another thing about boundaries is that they often have to be reinforced, especially if it's the first time doing it. And so when someone inevitably violates a boundary or steps over a boundary, you have to lovingly remind them of the boundary. And ultimately there have to be consequences attached to a boundary in order for them to be effective. That looks like practically if auntie is refusing to do your hair properly or refusing to remedy the result, there comes a point where you might say, I'm leaving, or I'm not paying for this, or negotiate on how much you feel like paying for the hair because they have not honoured what it was that you've asked them to do, for example. Or in a heated conversation, if you don't stop yelling at me, I'm going to take myself out of this conversation. Boundaries are more about self-control than they are about others' control, because you can't control the the person doing your hair. You can't necessarily control the person shouting at you, but you can control what you will and won't tolerate. And that's what boundaries are there to do, to protect you. The fourth thing I think is about dealing with the guilt. If you're an easygoing person, then you typically deal with a lot of guilt around not being good enough or not doing enough for your friends. And especially on the reverse, when you begin setting boundaries, a lot of guilt comes up in, am I being mean? Am I being too harsh? Am I being too critical? And in most of these cases, the answer is no, you're not being too harsh or being too mean or being too critical. The people in your life are just having a hard time adjusting. To that, I say, feeling guilty doesn't mean that you actually are guilty. It doesn't mean that you are guilty. The fact that you feel those feelings of awkwardness or like this is too intense doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Feeling wrong doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. And feeling guilty doesn't mean that you are. My fifth point would definitely be to reevaluate your relationship circles. As I mentioned at the start, givers attract takers. And it's very, very likely that you surrounded yourself with people in your life that take from you at extreme measure and people that perhaps don't even pour into you. And this can look like friendships where you don't really get asked, how are you doing? Or do you need help? Or do you need support? Sometimes that's because we haven't positioned ourselves in such a way to receive that. But sometimes that's also because the people around us don't really care past what they can receive from us. If that's you, I want you to do an inventory of the relationships around you. Do these relationships refuel me? Do they refresh me? Do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? Do I feel loved? Am I cherished in these spaces? If the answer is no, the next question becomes, can I be? Is there room for this? Do I need to embrace more vulnerability? Do I need to bring people into my humanity to show them a little bit more that actually I have needs, I have desires, I have wants? Or have these relationships run their course? Do these people even possess the capacity to actually help me in the direction that I want to go in? The last point I'll say to the person that's easygoing, which is really kind of like the first one, the first point or the most important point, is it's really important to know who you are. It's really important to be established in who you are. You probably have gifts of charity and gifts of mercy. You're someone who loves to share and to give and to support. Those things are virtues, and those are things that shouldn't be taken away. But alongside that needs to be the affirmation that you deserve that as well. You deserve to be poured into. I had a client say to me once that they give a lot more love than they receive. And she said it like it was a positive thing. And I had to ask her, and what do you think about that? What do you think about that? That you pour out far more love than you actually receive. And that's not to say that the scales have to be even all the time, or we have to measure cup for cup how much love is being received. But if you feel like you're at a deficit in receiving from the relationships in your life, that's something that needs analyzing. That's something that needs to be worked on. Have you believed the lie that you're unlovable? Have you believed the lie that your needs don't matter? Have you believed the lie that other people's needs matter far more than yours? And these things are things that we're socialized into. From your birth order to the family structures around you, growing up and how you were raised. What is the lie that you told yourself in order to make yourself easygoing? Easygoing or having an easygoing nature is often a response to feeling overlooked, feeling neglected. And so it's really important to affirm what's true of yourself. I anchor my identity in the Word of God. And if He knows and counts the hairs on my head, then they clearly matter. If He says He created me fearfully and wonderfully, then I clearly matter. And so reconnecting with worthiness, reconnecting with the fact that I am valued by God, and actually in the relationships around me, there are people that value me too. That allows me to begin to mentally take up more space than I would have. I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and we were talking a little bit about motherhood, the hood, and just the various things, the various plates that we spin. And what's become abundantly clear as women, being a wife, being a mum, and everything else typically comes ahead or above us just being ourselves, being women. And it's sad because everything else flows from that place of feeling anchored, rested, grounded. We're often looking for permission to rest. And I did a really good episode on rest. If you haven't seen that, go back a couple episodes. Everything is anchored on that. Our ability to show up for our families, our homes, our workplaces, whatever it is anchored on our ability to show up for ourselves. And so if you're not actively doing that, if you're not actively pouring into yourself, how on earth do you plan on consistently pouring into other people? Goes back to my first point about prioritizing yourself. And the analogy I love to give, and maybe you've heard of it, is when you are on the plane, and we recently traveled to the Caribbean, and how old was my daughter at the time? She wasn't 2 yet, so she was on my lap. Well, actually on my husband's lap. And one of the things that they tell you on the plane is that in a case of an emergency, when the oxygen masks come on and all of that stuff and they fall down into the cabin, secure yours first. Put your oxygen mask on first before you help anyone else with theirs, including your child. Because you are not going to be a great help to your child if the oxygen is dropping and you yourself can't breathe. So how you take care of yourself really, truly matters. And so for the easygoing person, I dare you to not make your whole identity about being easygoing. It's okay for you to generally be an easygoing person, but there are some things that rock your boat. There are some things that frustrate you, and you too are entitled to intense emotion, to intense thoughts, opinions on certain things, and you should be around people that welcome that value that prioritize you too, that want to hear from you as well. People that are willing to serve you equally as well as you serve others. Being a doormat is not a virtue. Not being supported isn't a virtue. Never having anyone help meet your needs is not a virtue. It's just not. You're worthy, you're deserving of all the support, all the love, all the care. And so don't be afraid to put yourself forward for that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I pray that this episode was an absolute blessing to you. Please share it with a friend, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Lots of love.